Down to food, one of my favourite subjects. Eating red meat twice a week increases the chance of developing type 2 diabetes. That's according to a new Harvard University study of more than 200,000 people's dietary habits. Now, its research will be music to the ears of some, but is this the proof of the benefits of a plant-based diet that some claim it is? Earlier this evening, I explored that question with Vegetarian Society Chief Executive Richard McIlwain and Professor Roy Taylor, who is a physician, diabetologist and director of the Newcastle Magnetic Resonance Centre. And I began by asking Richard what he and his Vegetarian Society colleagues had made of the Harvard paper.
We're the world's oldest organisation campaigning on this subject since 1847, and really, I think this study should be referred to as yet another study which highlights the benefits of cutting out meat from your diet. It is one of many. It's one of a long line of studies that have come to the fore, and I just think, at what point are we actually going to act on these studies, and particularly this one, which is such a huge cohort of people and demonstrably shows that there is a definite link between meat consumption and type 2 diabetes.
Although they're particularly concerned about those who eat at least 2 portions a day on average, so bacon for breakfast and a ham sandwich for lunch, they're 62% more likely to get diabetes than those who limited themselves, it says here, to 2 servings of red meat a week. So a lot of people are going to take comfort in that and say variety is the spice of life. I'm not cutting meat out of my diet altogether. These vegetarians, well, let them go out to the extremes if they want to, but I want a balanced diet.
I think what they also show is there's a linear relationship between consumption. So even if you're eating small amounts of meat, you're still increasing your potential risk of contracting type 2 diabetes. And this is shown from other studies, longitudinal studies carried out over many, many years with cohorts of people. So, yeah, absolutely. Of course, I would be a fan of people reducing the meat. I'm an even bigger fan of people cutting out meat from their diet altogether. And of course, the NHS, the good old NHS, is a fan of people cutting down on their meat as well. The Eat Well guide, if listeners are aware of that or want to Google that, it shows the typical plate that we should all be eating. And what you very quickly realize is that meat is a very small proportion of that overall plate. We eat far too much meat. It's also the types of meat we're eating, lots of processed meats, which this study and many other studies show actually do increase the risk of type 2 diabetes over unprocessed meats.
Yep. Well, let's bring in Professor Roy Taylor. Now, Roy, you have you've got a specialist interest in diabetes, of course. And first of all, let's just run the study by you because people are hanging their hat on it. I mean, it's the largest study yet to identify this link between red meat and diabetes, looking at data from 216,000 adults in the US, their diets monitored for up to 36 years, and 22,000 developing type 2 diabetes. Is it as robust as Richard says? I mean, and are you as comforted by this as he is?
I think we need to look under the bonnet and sort out various conflicting points, because to take the point that Richard made, if we regard this as yet another study which shows, yes, that's absolutely right. And so there is a link between people who eat a lot of red meat and type 2 diabetes. But that's to overlook the main link, because people who eat a lot of meat tend to be heavier. And that's a critical issue. So if I talk about the vegetarian approach for a moment, yes, that's associated with lower body weight. It's associated with better health in general, lower heart disease risk, for instance. Yes, all of that's true. And then the environmental concerns. Yes, absolutely right. Coming back to type 2 diabetes, it's not so clear. If we quote the editorial that accompanied this paper in the journal, it gives things away somewhat. This paper may contribute to the discussion on how certain we can be. This is an area of intense uncertainty. And let me just point out, Michael, the larger a study, the more liable it is to confounders.
Really? Why would that be?
Well, because if you look at people who wear sandals, for instance, habitually, you'll find that a lot of them also tend to follow other lifestyle patterns. In other words, we're dealing with people. And if a person indulges in one of a group of patterns, they're likely to indulge in another. So the argument against the direct link between red meat and diabetes is very clear. It can't be tied down. And let me just give you a very concrete example of that. My close colleague in Germany, McIlwain, who's professor of diabetes in Dusseldorf, did a large study such as this, not as large, but a large one in Germany, and discovered that red meat eating, along with low fiber consumption and high caffeine, was associated with one of the main drivers of type 2 diabetes, which is resistance to the action of the hormone insulin resistance. But Michael didn't leave it there, because at that point, it's exactly the same conclusion as the study we're talking about today. Michael took it forward by saying, okay, we can do a prospective study and get large groups of people randomized either to have high red meat or no red meat, low fiber, high fiber, and look at the results. And so they did that and found there was absolutely no difference. In other words, when you correct for potential confounders, the meat itself is not contributing to type 2 diabetes, which comes very much into line with my work. I welcome any sort of diet which brings down body weight, and that is a really important point.
Right.
But to suggest that one particular foodstuff is causing type 2 diabetes is ludicrous, illustrated merely by looking at India, the population with one of the largest sections of vegetarians, with the greatest number of people with type 2 diabetes in the world.
Right. I've got to run that by Richard, Chief Exec of the Vegetarian Society. This is about intersectionality. There are too many other things going on, maybe comorbidities. We've got to bring those in.
And correlation studies, they always are open to dissection around, what other sort of confounding factors are in there that might be underlying. I mean, when you look at the paper, this particular paper, they're at pains to stress that they have corrected for a range of different lifestyle factors. And also, they say in the paper that with adjustment for BMI, which obviously is an indication of body weight, the positive association between meat and type 2 diabetes was partially attenuated, but still highly significant. And they go on to document potentially, and this is potentially some causal factors, which is things like excess saturated fat, the heme iron, which is specific to red meat, and the nitrates and nitrites, which are very specific to processed meats like bacon and sausage, actually can play a causal role in cell insulin resistance, which is, the primary driver of type 2 diabetes. So, absolutely, I take the point. We can't hang everything onto one study.
And let me throw in another point, Richard. Vegetarian food, great in principle, but in practice, there are some vegetarian products, and I've seen some of these in the market myself when I've been looking, which are full of things that I might consider ultra-processed. That might be unhealthy for me too.
Yeah, and the ultra-processed food is clearly something we're very focused on as an organisation. And really, if you want the healthiest vegetarian and vegan diet, then you're looking at a whole foods vegetarian and vegan diet. That said, I think the ultra-processed foods classification is a very broad brush, which targets some foods very unfairly. So if you've got a mycoprotein steak, if I'm allowed to use brand names, Quorn would be one. Mm-hmm. I would say that's very different to crisps and fizzy pop, which also fall into the definition of ultra-processed, and which overconsumption of leads to high BMIs and some of the factors that we're seeing here. So I don't think what we're saying is eat ultra-processed foods 3 times a day, just as health professionals will say don't eat red meat 3 times a day. I think what we're saying is this study suggests it's good to swap out red meat with plant proteins, eat as many whole food plant proteins as you can, but actually the occasional burger or sausage, as long as it's plant-based rather than meat, as part of the diet is probably going to do no harm at all. And in comparison to eating red meat is probably going to be beneficial.
And that was the Vegetarian Society Chief Exec Richard McIlwain in debate with Professor Roy Taylor, the physician and diabetologist.